Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we are live. Welcome to the Hot Pole Position podcast, the weekly podcast where we talk about music tech and everything that has gone on in the music tech world. So, I am your host, Adam Steele, and that is the weird advertising music in the background. And yes, it's going to be a solo podcast today. Liam is unavailable for the evening, which means that it's just you and me. So if anybody's got any questions that they want to throw in chat, there's going to be quite a lot of Q&A tonight on the stream, because not having a co-host means it's going to be a lot easier when I've got people asking me questions to answer. So without further ado, here's the thing that made the podcast delayed this week. This is the new mix of the audio on the intro video. This is the Hot Pole Position podcast. I wonder what you guys thought of that. Yes, this is the weekly music tech news podcast where we tend to answer questions from the chat, but also talk about what's been going on through the week. I just listened back to that track there, having literally just thrown the mix together on these headphones in a rather noisy environment. It sounds okay. It sounds better than the first remix, which when I hit render and listen back was just snare. And as one of the viewers in chat quite rightly says, a mix is never finished, just abandoned. Yes, I have definitely got faster at mixing over the years, but I still go back and tinker, generally speaking. So, this week's been a heck of a week. I've been rather unwell again, some sort of common cold, not the type that's in the news at the moment. Which I'm going to not use the keyword that everyone's panicking about because that's an easy way to be demonetized. Let's call it what Gamers Nexus called it, which was human malware, which I thought was rather amusing and also probably fairly accurate. But yes, that is going to creep into the news a little bit this week because significant events have been postponed. Yeah, so a lot of events have started to succumb to the effects of this rather large event that's going around. Is everybody hearing me okay? It's not too loud. I've got this hitting the Valve stage now in the audience sono fairly hard, and then I've got a limiter going on in OBS. So if anything doesn't sound right, by all means let me know, because it's kind of hard to keep perspective from here. I've just turned the treble down, for instance, because I can already feel there's quite a significant S sound on this, because, I just kind of picked up on it. It's quite hard to monitor your own voice, because whilst I'm making sounds, my jawbone is actually vibrating through my head, so there's probably nowhere near the same, audio quality to my voice that I actually think I'm hearing, which is something you kind of get used to, but it's still a bit weird. So, this week we've had a couple of little studio upgrades. The lights now should be on every week because they've got what are called dummy batteries in them. More bassy and sultry, yeah. As possibly partly because of the pod mic, and partly because, funnily enough, my young daughter Ivy came in to say goodnight just before the stream started, and being the 2-year-old-ish that she is, decided to start messing with all the knobs on the desk. And I'll just turn the camera around, and on the desk here, of course, is the sono. But I'm doing something rather weird. I've got the microphone going in to the input 1 and being sent to the Valve section, which is supposed to be for guitar. But I'm actually using it on vocal with no cab sim, and I had it so the input was really low down so the tube wasn't getting driven too hard, but also with the input on the mic pretty much cranked because it's a dynamic mic. And it was actually, if I got too loud, kind of starting to clip. And I think what was happening was I was driving the first stage of this valve a bit too hard. And accidentally, Ivy turned up the input and turned down the mic overall gain there. And it actually sounded better. So, hooray for Mix Engineer Child. Everything suddenly sounds good. And yeah, it's rather interesting. So yeah, I've got a little bit of a low-end boost here and a bit of a mid push to make sure it sounds relatively Neumann-esque, shall we say. Because as much as OBS has things like noise gates and limiters built in, it doesn't have anything like an EQ, which apparently OBS does have the possibility to load VSTs, but I didn't want to get too deep into that. Not too SE on the says the chat. That is good. Lovely. So that's good to hear. I can see behind me now because I've gone on single camera. I've widened the camera out. I can actually see that all the tiles behind me are wonky, which, funnily enough, I don't really need them anymore. The acoustic foam was really only in this room to dampen the room reflections when I was using a condenser mic for the podcast. I don't tend to mix on monitors. Well, I don't mix on monitors at all in here. I tend to work on headphones at home and then go back to the studio with my nice big monitor setup. So most of what I do here is general broad brush strokes, filming for instructional videos or editing, basically. Like if I've been working with a drummer or a singer and it all needs chopping and cleaning up and that kind of thing, I can do that at home and then actually get a proper mix balance back when I'm on a decent monitoring system. Not to say that these are bad. 650s are probably the best that I'll get for headphones, And I reactivated my SonarWorks subscription recently, having not had it on this new laptop, which I've only had now for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, something like that. So yeah, it was overdue, but yeah, I'm rambling. If you guys have got any questions that you want to ask this week, feel free to ask straight away this week in the chat. Usually we leave them to the end, but seeing as though it's just me, it's going to be good to have people to talk to, because I'm sat in a box basically talking to myself. So, before we do anything else, let's talk about the news. The news! So, Native Instruments are set to update their machine hardware this month. Apparently, you'll be able to produce entire tracks from start to finish, which is really quite impressive. Native Instruments, they are quite good at interacting with their user base. That I will definitely attest to. And yes, from what I gather, they're going to be upgrading the firmware, starting with version 2.1, which includes an auto-growing patterns feature. That sounds terrifying. That sounds like AI. It's like, here's a... Oh, right, no, it means that, you don't have to define, like, this is an 8-bar section, this is a 16-bar section. You can just keep going and it will automatically trim things to the nearest bar. That's very clever. You can start offsets on each pattern, which means that it doesn't have to be perfectly 4-beat, 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 4-beat. And pattern play position, that means that you'll be able to know where you're at. So yeah, good news for people who want to make stuff like dancey electronic type stuff on a Native Instruments machine, that it will be easier and easier to make full performances. Some of the gripes that I have with things like Ableton Live, in the basics, I know you can do advanced stuff with it, I just personally didn't get that far, is that I don't always work in set numbers of bars and set numbers of loops, because I'm not generally working on what you might call that kind of music, electronic or hip hop or basically stuff that's 4/4 all the way through. I tend to work with a lot of bands and acts where that's not necessarily the case, where you might drop half a bar here or whatever. And they tend to think in verses or choruses that may have an extra bit here, drop a bit there. But yeah, if that's your kind of thing, it's really good to know that Native Instruments are doing that kind of thing. On to the one that I only found this out after I named the show. This is pretty big, but of course, again, like I said, I didn't want to be demonetized because of the key headlines that have been going around the news over the last couple of weeks. Frankfurt's Musikmesse is postponed due to concerns about this, which is a shame. I was hoping to go to Musikmesse this year, but Pro Light and Sound will be rescheduled for May 26th to 29th, and a new date is yet to be set for Musikmesse. Of course, it is always expensive doing these kind of trips, but yeah, Musikmesse is the European counterpart essentially to NAMM, which means it's a lot closer to me. And so I was hoping to go to spend more time with the manufacturers that I know and meet people that I don't already know, especially people that, you know, are actually within a reasonable distance of me. But it seems to be working out okay. Just as an aside, I may have mentioned last week that I was doing videos, you know, in the future with two companies from Latvia who are actually unrelated to each other, which is really strange for an English company for two to happen at one time. But it just goes to show that European, you know, considering European going all the way out to, you know, former Soviet type companies, all it takes is a mention from the right person and an email in the right place. So it's actually a lot less stress to just do that rather than try and meet everybody in 3 days. And as much as I absolutely loved the NAMM experience, oh boy, it was exhausting. I've still not quite finished working with all the fallout from that, which is a good thing, but oh boy. So yes, there are also shows that have either been postponed or cancelled entirely. Slipknot have now postponed stuff. Sons of Apollo, which is Mike Portnoy's supergroup with Bumblefoot and Billy Sheehan and Derek Sherinian, who's also played with Joe Bonamassa and people like that, and Jeff Scott Soto, who used to sing with Yngwie Malmsteen. They've decided to postpone their European tour, probably because a lot more countries now are shutting down touring and that kind of thing. They're not allowing bands to play because, you know, I suppose the thing is you could turn up in one town, meet 1,000 fans, contract a virus, turn up at the next town. Yeah, apparently Formula 1 is all up in the air as well. It makes sense because public events where thousands upon thousands of people gather are a very quick way to spread any kind of disease. It's a bit of a running joke of, they call it Namthrax, when people go to the NAMM event and everybody gets ill afterwards. I know that the two guys I went with, Liam and Charlie, both got very sick after we got back. They're both okay now. But yeah, it knocked them both out for a week. I think the only reason I was spared is because I spent the last year and a half with a small child picking up every single virus and giving them to me. So, yeah, already had, you know, yeah, I already had most of that. But yeah, this is just a new strain of a new virus. And, you know, to a large extent, I think there's a lot of media hype over this entire thing. From what they've been saying, the number of actual, you know, casualties from this is far less than most strains of most well-known illnesses. So it's just got a nasty name and is the thing that's in the news right now. So let's move on from that to something that's this one is the title. Oh boy. So there was something like 10 articles on this, but if you haven't been following this, Behringer, who've been making, this is Behringer Corner for the week, but it's also the main headline this week because it's a real big thing. Behringer as a company have been copying pedals, synths recently, and one of their detractors, critics, someone who reviews a lot of their stuff, a man called Peter Kern, has been very scathing of Behringer over the way that they've decided to do things. Personally, I don't think there's too much wrong with what Behringer are doing as long as the legalities are taken care of. But apparently Peter Kern has been negative on every particular turn, so much so that he's drawn the ire and attention of Behringer's marketing department. Now, there is a pedal called the cork-sniffer, which is a joke based on people who wine snobs, essentially. And there's a long-standing joke with wine snobs where, although of course a few especially gifted people may be able to really describe detailed wine, I think most people make a lot of that up to try and feel better about themselves and to try and play along with the rest of the crowd. And some people drinking, especially red wine, are known to sniff the cork after it's been popped, and I don't know if there's any merit to that. I do enjoy a good red, but I'm not that deep into it. But being a cork sniffer is generally a term of derision, shall we say. And so that translated over, Behringer made, they didn't actually make, but they made a 3D model of a Kern, as in Peter Kern, cork sniffer pedal. Essentially a retaliation to probably some of his, what would you call it, criticisms. Let's go to the news and see if there's a specific... Yeah, there we go. So they made a cork sniffer pedal, and I thought it was mildly amusing. I wouldn't say it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. I thought it was kind of, slightly amusing. And it was one of those, oh, ha, who's that guy? Oh, right, okay. That's kind of funny, let's move on. It probably wasn't meant to be a big deal. I certainly didn't think it was a big deal. But there's been a big public outrage, apparently. Some people have tried to insinuate that because this character, which is obviously a caricature of Peter Kern, because of the extended nose and because of the slight baldness, some people have taken to claiming some people have taken to claiming that there's some sort of religious connotation. I'm trying not to use specific trigger words here, but to me that seems very silly as an accusation to throw at Behringer, because they're definitely... I can see here that this is supposed to be a slightly, puerile humour, bit of a dig. And so since then, Behringer have issued a public apology and apparently claim that they'll give Peter Kern the trademark that they made. And since then, apparently there's been some further negativity from Peter Kern, so they've actually deleted their Facebook apology. So, yeah, it's all a bit weird that, Uli Behringer himself has apparently stuck up for the company, and at least for some of the claims that have been made against him. So, Peter Kern used CDM as his platform. He also makes synths himself. Let's have a look. What company? Me Blip, I think. Yeah. Someone should do a Behringer delay pedal. It's just a carbon copy. The irony would be if it's a carbon copy of a carbon copy. But yeah, apparently this isn't the first time that Behringer have had a go at Peter Kern, making this thing that's basically cardboard. And then this is what we were talking about recently with Behringer saying that technology is free to use unless it's protected, which is technically true. And then, yeah, 3 days ago they released what is obviously a 3D model and not a physical product of this, which is a copy of an actual pedal called the cork-sniffer. Yeah. And yeah, they've said they'll cancel their trademark application for the Peter Kern name. And oh, that's right. So Peter Kern has said, "Oh, send your synths to me." And at some point, he said apparently something about destroying your synths, which seems silly. So yeah, Behringer have now removed their apology and uploaded a demo of their Roland 909 copy, the RD9. So yeah, that's it. They aren't mentioning it anymore. I think it's a whole lot of bluster over nothing. I think they had a particularly nasty detractor that they decided to have a go back at, and someone's cried that they've gone too far, so they've gone, okay, we went too far, and stopped it there. And unless anyone's got anything to add to that in the chat, I think that's just about the wrap up of that whole situation. But talk about storm in a teacup. So, moving on. Reopen close tab, thank you very much. Unity Audio are releasing the Mini Boulder and Mini Boulder DSP. For a while I was looking at getting Unity Audio Boulders for the studio. The Boulder Mark III is an absolute beast of a near-field monitor. But they are very, very heavy and very, very expensive. So it's all very, very clever technology. The Mini Boulder seems to use one 8-inch woofer instead of two. If I was going to go for this kind of thing with the two 8-inch woofers in it, that would replace my 2.2 setup, because I actually have two subwoofers right now. So this would probably make it much more phase accurate in the low end, because as great as it is having all the low end, because of where I have to put them, they are slightly obscured, but that kind of works at the moment. Yeah, so it's still using an aluminium cone, much like Hartke's bass drivers, which actually gives them a real solid definition. If there's one thing that I can say about having Hartke bass gear before, is that their aluminium speakers, as bright as they are also incredibly phase accurate. They do not buckle, they do not bend. The tweeter is mounted inside the 5-inch ring mid-range driver, which is an interesting design. So it's actually a 3-way design, but this ring around the tweeter actually moves the tweeter in and out, which keeps it phase accurate with the mid. That's really interesting. And so it's got a 300 watt amp for the bottom and 200 watt amps for the mid-range and tweeter, which is a lot more than my Adam A7Xs have inside them. It's 18mm Baltic birch plywood, which is about that thick. That's as thick as my Zilla guitar cabinets. That's seriously thick. It's a sealed enclosure as well, which is weird. But that means that it's far more accurate. Ports on monitors generally help to extend the low range at the expense of accuracy, because there are certain frequencies then that resonate really well and certain ones that don't resonate nearly well. So yeah, it's got a much more gradual roll off on the bass. Let's have a look, see if we can find the cost. Oh boy. So the mini boulders for a pair is £5,000, and with DSP is £5,400. So it's only a 10% increase to get the DSP stuff. Which, personally, I mean, having 24-bit 96K conversion inside them, including 8-band EQ with a 1/10 of a decibel gain resolution and all that kind of stuff, I would probably go for the DSP version, because for the extra 10%, if you're gonna go for something like this, you may as well go all in. And yeah, that's the thing. I've often said that anything like this, not just monitors, but microphones, all sorts of high-end gear, the price goes minimal, bit more, lot more, whoosh. And there's a very steep curve on the way up. So I don't know how much more resolution and quality I would get out of these compared to my A7Xs, considering that they cost about 5 to 6 times more. I can tell you they wouldn't sound 5 or 6 times as good. Although that's very, very hard to quantify, of course. They probably would sound better, probably would sound more accurate, which is what they're going for, of course. But the amount that they sound better, especially with my curved live room, with the side of the building being round and that kind of thing, there's only so much that I can do in there, and it's all, I'd be better off spending all that money on room treatment. Which, I mean, my room's already floating and relatively well treated, but even then, yeah, whoa. I mean, I certainly wouldn't need the full-size boulders in my live room, I can tell you that, because the A7Xs with the sub-8s is already more than enough level to send me dizzy, with plenty of headroom, so, yeah. But they're there, and they're available. And if you've got money to spend in a well-treated live room, you can certainly do worse than these. Now, last piece of news. IK Multimedia have released their iRig Pro Duo, which is an audio and MIDI interface that works for Mac and PC and iOS and Android, which is probably why I thought it was worth mentioning, because it's quite tricky to get some really nice interfaces to work with iOS, because they've got to be powered and that kind of thing. And I'll have to, yeah. So this runs on 2 AA batteries if you can't bus power it, which is odd because that's 3 volts and USB is 5 volts, which means that somewhere in there must be a step-up converter, which means that the AA batteries won't last very long at all. I'm quite sure of that, because running AA batteries don't put out a huge amount of current to begin with, and then essentially you'd be stepping up the voltage to almost twice what the batteries are capable of, which means they deliver half the current. And when you're trying to run Class A preamps and all the technology and phantom power, if it's phantom power on 2 microphone inputs, that's gonna drain them very, very quickly and probably not sustain proper 48 volts. It's very hard to do, especially running off 3 volts. And I know that because I've got one of the old Zoom H4Ns, and that can run off AA batteries. As soon as you engage 48 volt phantom power for those 2 mic inputs on that, and that's quite a bit bigger than this iRig Pro Duo looks to be, the battery level just drops like a stone, and it goes from something like 9 to 10 hours of recording time to maybe 2 at most. What I did manage to do recently, if you saw the Audience Evo video, is you can have like a USB splitter cable and plug in a power brick to run the power and run the data through to an iOS or Android device. So in chat, maybe it's a combination of the bus and the batteries. Good idea, but the major issue with iOS devices is they can't put out pretty much any power at all. I think it's something like 30 milliamps they can supply, which, considering a USB socket's supposed to give you 500 milliamps, that falls way short and can only power very, very, very light things like a mouse or a keyboard, or like Apogee did the little jam interface, which barely had any lights on it, didn't do 48 volt, didn't actually have a mic preamp if I remember rightly. So yeah, it's... Having said that, if you've got the brand new iPad Pro which has a USB-C socket on it, they can actually output quite a lot of power. They can power the Audient Evo directly, I have learned, because that iPad Pro with the USB-C is designed to have quite a lot of power going in or out, which is an instant plus compared to the old Lightning design. So hopefully this whole thing that was brewing away with EU courts making them have a standard port on iPhones could be a good thing in the future. So let's start with the questions in chat. So one of the guys has said, do I have any thoughts on the AMD 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs that a lot of people are using for music production? And what Ryzen 4th gen CPUs will bring in latency and price to performance? So 4th gen Ryzen's it's really hard to speculate. It looks to me, because I've been trying to keep track, like it's going to be a moderate improvement on the 3rd gen, because it's going to be essentially based on the same hardware as the 3rd gen, because so Ryzen 1st gen and 2nd gen were actually both based on Zen architecture. The 3000 series is based on Zen 2 architecture, just to be confusing. So as far as I remember, the 4000 series is going to be Zen 2 Plus. So it's the same architecture with some small improvements. So it's not really worth waiting, I don't think, if you're going ahead with it. I've said time and time again, I am dead against the idea of Hackintoshes. I really don't like that idea. Not that it's not possible, it's very possible. My long-standing argument with that is if you can get a perfect setup working, because Apple very specifically don't want you to, so they put a lot of measures in place for you not to be able to do that. Like there are loads of security checks in the operating system that have to be circumvented, lots of driver things have to be overcome. If you perfectly get that working, you then can't change a thing on that at all, because if you do, you might well break it. And so that threatens stability, and as a professional I can't risk that. I would either fork out the money and get an actual Mac, or I would just go to Windows, because if you're using digital audio workstations, the underlying operating system has practically no bearing on what you're doing anyway. Let's be honest, if your gripe is Mac OS over Windows, let it go. Because, I mean, aside from me having a start bar at the bottom here, I'm on a Windows laptop, and it's far more powerful than an iPad of twice the a MacBook Pro of twice the price. And I've got all my ports, and apart from that bar at the bottom, I'm using OBS, which I would be using on a Mac. I'm using Chrome, which I would be using on a Mac. I'm using Reaper, which I would be using on a Mac. I'm using Premiere, which I would be using on a Mac. Everything is the same. So essentially, I don't use Windows. I don't use Mac OS. I use whatever's there to get me to the programs that are identical on both platforms. So I don't know. I've long since held that belief. But yeah, Ryzen processors are really powerful, and it's definitely, our market segment has changed from 90% Intel, 10% AMD to I think the last count was 85% AMD, because people have realised how much Intel are absolutely stiffing us in terms of performance to what you're paying. And right now, AMD have got the crown. They just do. Their chip design is brilliant. The best way to break this down is that Intel, when they make a chip, they make a chip. It's big. It's got a lot of stuff on it, which means that if one part of that fails, the entire thing has to go in the trash. And that happens quite a lot more than you might think. With AMD's design, they've used what you might call a chiplet design, which means that it's actually made of 3 or 4 little chips that are all kind of stuck together using copper, using communication terminals, which means that if one of those things, when they're built, fails, they throw that little piece in the trash and put a new little piece in, and that means you're not throwing away $100 or $200 worth of silicon because one tiny piece failed. And the other thing is AMD have got there first in terms of using 7 nanometer, which means much smaller electronics, which means much less heat generation. And that's an advantage for AMD because they don't own their own fabrication plants. They use a company called TSMC, whereas Intel own their own production plants. And if Intel don't have the technology to keep up with them, which apparently they don't right now, then they're stuck. So my desktop machine at the studio has an Intel 6700K in, which is 6000 series. The architecture that that's built on is now 7, 8, 9, 10, 4 generations old, and yet every single one of those generations essentially uses the same design and same architecture with some very small improvements. Intel have stalled. Intel have struggled to get beyond the 14 nanometer process. They haven't advanced any, and the only reason that they've got any faster since the 6700K is they're either stuffing more cores onto the same processor, running it faster. They might have like 10% of improvement through architecture and design improvements, but if it was a 4-core now versus a 4-core then, you're not seeing very much more improvement. And if there's a 6 or an 8 or a 10 core, the amount of heat it produces goes up with that. Which can also be said for AMD, but AMD have got round that by making the smaller components, like we said, which generate less heat, which is why they can slam up to 32 or even 64 cores if you're insane into the same die and get away with it without it melting. So, yeah, I mean, it used to be that AMD were the underdogs. Then the design genius from Intel moved to AMD, designed Ryzen, and has really set the cat amongst the pigeons, which is why the old thing of only trust Intel has now gone right out of the window, because the genius that was at Intel isn't there anymore. And the AMD guy is the genius. Or at least he was. He's now left the company, but he's left with them this imprint of the Zen and Ryzen plan and the architecture. Also, yes, SmartTV is quite right in chat. If you're going to get something like that, get it soon, because of this whole human malware, or whatever you want to call it, situation that's happening around the world. A lot of production plants in China have either stalled or had to tremendously slow down, which means that the components they make, which supply the companies elsewhere, mean that their inventory is low, which means that only a few weeks from now, the inventory around the world for overall finished products is going to be low, which means prices are going to go up. So, going back to the mixer, a 300 ohm mic at 48 volts would ideally use 160 milliamps. And one AA battery has got 2,000 to 3,000 milliamp hours. Yeah, but that's in an ideal scenario. Generally, I'm sure microphones tend to be at 600 ohms, and it's all to do with transmission efficiency and running things over a length of cable and so on and so on. But in my experience, you turn on phantom power on any of these devices, and the come on, brain, the battery life does drain quickly. Whether it's because the batteries get hot and then when they're hot they're less efficient, or whether it's that the power draw turns out to be more because of the upscaling of voltage, losing efficiency, or that kind of thing, then that's what happens. Let's have a look. So, got a 6-year-old i3 Toshiba. It's dying fast. It's just at local Best Buy. May look into AMD again. Well, AMD have now got back into the mid-tier laptop market, and the first thing I would suggest is, why is your old laptop dying? Is it just because it doesn't have an SSD? Because if you put an SSD in a lot of machines, they suddenly go from, oh my god, I'm going to throw this out the window, to, oh, this is kind of okay again. Like I was saying when I got the new laptop, in my new laptop video, I'd actually been using a very old Lenovo ThinkPad when I went to NAMM, which was actually capable of video editing and producing live on the floor, because I'd put a 250GB SSD in it as opposed to the old crappy spinning drive, which was really holding it back. Windows 10's not designed for spinning drives, so it might be a lot cheaper to try that first. Franz Plugger says, wasn't all this predicted by Moore's Law quite a while back? Yes, but the problem with Moore's Law is we seem to have hit, largely speaking, an impasse because we're starting to come up against the laws of physics. Components now, especially the traces towards components, are on the order of 14 to 7 nanometer, which is a lot smaller than the size of the pin of a laser beam. So it's actually like trying to have a chip designed by a 3-year-old trying to colour in with a wax crayon, because the designs are so small that we don't really have the technology, or at least we're just getting there, to draw things that small. So the only way up now is out, which is why multi-core has become the big deal, because we are genuinely starting to hit those processing limits just because of physics, and the only way out at the moment, at least, is to just multiply it out. At least on the x86 platform. I reckon the x86's days are numbered at this point, but it's been going for 30 odd years so far. So AMD is a very good chip in the 3900X. Yep, selling for $419 on Amazon. So it's keeping up with the 14-core Intel high-end desktop. Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't even worry about that kind of stuff, because my studio machine is still a 6700K, which is only a quad-core, and I don't tend to get beyond about 50% processor usage on a heavy mix. So why do I need 8 or 12 or 16 cores when 4's fine? It's not 8K video editing that we do. What we do requires a significant amount of computing, but processors recently have gone like that in terms of performance because of the multi-core thing, and the demand that we put on them hasn't done that. So you don't really have to worry about being right on the cutting edge right now, because where we used to have to be on the cutting edge to try and get all our native processing done, computer processing units have become more and more and more powerful, and what we do hasn't got more and more and more complex. So it's actually a really good time to be an in-the-box producer right now. If you get yourself a 6 or 8 core chip of any denomination, Intel or AMD, you are not going to be struggling for a long time. So yeah, not looking to build a laptop, but for a laptop ready to go. All I can say is look for something that's of decent value and that benchmarks well. I tend to watch Linus Tech Tips channel and things like those kind of channels where they review laptops, and I tend to look at, because all the processing units are largely the same and the chipsets are actually largely the same, because there are only so many chipset types like the Z390 and X370 and all this kind of stuff. They generally don't tend to be that different from each other. So I tend to find that looking for things that a music producer wouldn't think of at first is now the key, where it used to be, is it powerful enough? Now I know it's powerful enough. Like, if you were to go, like, the laptop I got was an Intel-based 6-core, which was, I think, the 8790H, something like that. And there were 7 or 8 different laptops that I was looking at that all had the same processor. And they were all roughly the same price bracket. And so I started looking at these videos that told me things like the keyboard on this one's really bad, the screen on this one's really nice and bright. This one's got extra USB ports, which for a music producer with all your dongles and that kind of thing, that can be quite useful. This one's really quiet under load. That's really important if you're trying to track in the same room as a laptop. It's thin and it's light might be a concern for you. That's not a concern for me. Quietness is far more important to me. So at that point, I can't tell you what brand to go with. You have to do your own quick research. Try and find a price point that you're comfortable with. Try and find a few laptops in that price point. Then start looking for videos about those specific machines, and you will very quickly get a picture of which one's right for what you need it for. So, let's have a look. What cool music projects or bands am I mixing this month? Ooh, that almost seems like a loaded question, because I actually have a song that I can play you from last week. This is proper English old school punk. This is a band called Pressure 28, and this was recorded live in my live room. I think we overdubbed some gang vocals and a backing vocal on the choruses on these. But this sounds a bit rough. It sounds to me a lot like something like the Tony Hawk's Underground, Tony Hawk's type stuff. This is Loyal by Pressure 28, so I'm just going to play this.
British born, British bred, the red
And there you go, that's Loyal by Pressure 28. Proper old school punk. So, English Rancid, it is that kind of thing. So, yeah, Dave says, undecided on the snare sound. Well, there's no triggering in there. That is the actual sound of a pearl steel snare, quite a deep one, really tightly cranked. That was how he really wanted his snare sound to be. And it is quite distinctive. It's very them. In hindsight, and we did some other tracks a few months back where I actually used a few triggers on the kit and they liked the sound of me throwing quite a bit more reverb in, which was more of a big kind of sound, which surprised me that they wanted that kind of sound, but there we go. And in the conversation we've had since, they're coming back into the studio and we're probably going to tweak this mix to be more big and more reverberant, but it is quite kind of rancid-ish. So the input chain on that bass, so that was 2 channels on the bass. So one channel was the 2 notes La bass. It was a precision bass straight into it, with a fair bit of gain on, but still relatively clean. And the second channel was a Sansamp, but actually a software Sansamp with quite a lot of drive on, and between them I think it's got a virtual tape machine on. Yeah, just that snare didn't seem at the front. That's interesting because on my headphones that's pretty much what pops out to me straight away is snare, snare, snare. With it being live in the same room as the bass amp and the guitar amp as well, I was hesitant to really like over compress it, but I might drive it a bit more if we do revisit the mix, because that's a significant change to the mix. Hello to Bulldogs in the Twitch chat. We've picked someone up on an alternative platform. Hooray! That's always good. And just while we're waiting for more questions in the chat, just a quick announcement. Next week, we're going to have a guest host. We're going to have Jeremy Vareo. Jer from Donkeys and Demos is going to be on the show with me. So that's going to be a lot of fun. We've been working on some preset packs for the Line 6. Line 6, come on. Their Helix store. So Jeremy's really into stuff like classic thrash metal and power metal and that kind of stuff. So using my Zilla cabs that I've got at the studio, I've been making impulse responses of my cabs specifically for use with his presets. So we'll be talking about that next week in amongst the rest of the stuff. So yeah, Marty says the snare sounds pretty deep on headphones. It is like, I think it's a 14x7. It was a relatively actually deep snare, but it's got a definite ring because it's a steel shell. And hello to Anna in the chat. Anna's someone else that I'm doing a video with, just to share a story with the chat. So JZ Microphones got in touch a little while ago. They wanted me to do a review of one of their mics, and I said, yeah, cool, sure. They're based in Latvia, and so is Anna. And Anna's someone who I've worked with in the past. And so we said, hey, you're in Latvia, she's in Latvia, send the microphones to her first. So Anna's going to record something for me, and then send the microphones on. And if you're watching, have you, Anna, had a chance to try the Black Hole microphone yet? I know that she said she said that the HH1, the handheld mic, was really good. And yes, so David's just seen my Father Ted t-shirt, small, far away. Or as my daughter pokes one of the cows and goes, oosh, oosh, because apparently that's what cow sounds like when you're 18 months old. But yeah, my dad got this t-shirt for me from Northern Ireland, from a company called Northern Iron. And yes, so I do very much enjoy Father Ted. And it's funny, the colour on this on camera is slightly washed out. In real life, this shirt is green, like really Hulk green. And Ivy absolutely loves it. She loves really bright colours. And even from being born, when I had this t-shirt, she always instantly kind of gravitated towards it because it was a bright colour. And yeah. Oh, it's funny, when Ivy was born, in our previous house, I actually had a green screen up in the front room. And she would spend a lot of time just kind of staring at it like, ooh. Yeah, it's a shame I don't have a green screen up here because I don't really have any space for one, really. So I have to have the guitars behind me there. On the other side is all Mickey's art crap. It's not all crap, but it's like, oh, let's just show it. All the art stuff, because my wonderful partner is a wonderful artist, but to do that she needs a lot of crap. As artists often do. This is a Henning colour, yes, quite. Yeah, Henning doesn't do things by halves. I tend to like being a little more understated. But everyone's got their place on YouTube, right? Yeah. I met Henning very briefly at NAMM for about 5 seconds, but he was having a little sit down talking to Tor from TC Electronics. And the two of them just looked absolutely shattered. They were just sat there like, oh, you know, because everybody has to have a little downtime. So I wanted to go over and say hi, and they were both like, oh, hi, how are you doing? Because, you know, they just needed a break, which at NAMM, you need a break. So at that point, I was like, maybe I'll see you around. Yeah, that's why when I got back from NAMM, I slept for 24 straight hours, because, my God, it takes it out of everybody. New to the channel. Do I have any audio production on Linux? Not really. I'm thinking about it in the future, but it's a very niche thing, audio production on Linux right now. Although I would say that if you're interested in that, you can get Reaper from Reaper.fm, specifically compiled for Linux. And I do a lot of tutorials on Reaper, and that should work perfectly well, although I am still having a little bit of trouble getting external plugins working because most of them are compiled just for Windows and Mac OS, and that's a real roadblock. I did do a video on using Reaper on a Raspberry Pi, which was fascinating, but I ran into even further roadblocks with that Reaper runs perfectly well on a Raspberry Pi, but the plugins not only are not compiled for Linux, they're definitely not compiled for an ARM64 processor. So yes, Reaper is on Linux, so go and check that out from the Reaper.fm website. Yes. So, yeah, that's the way that music production kind of has to be right now. I'm on Windows mostly for 2 reasons. Number one, all the third-party plugins that I use, because my world revolves around third-party plugins, especially the Slate stuff, all compiled for Windows and Mac, and the Adobe Creative Suite, which again, I absolutely rely on, is Windows or Mac only. So, yes. Is there a GUI for Reaper? Well, Reaper is a GUI. What do you mean? Do you mean like themes and skins? Because they do exist. Oh, there's Reaper 6.05. Oh, one of them lets users render WAV and MP3 at the same time. I've got to check this out. Thank you very much to Anna for that heads up. So let's go back to browser. So, Reaper 6.05. So DDP has been tweaked by the look of it. ARA, which is something I've started to use more and more, which is how Melodyne and Vocaline and plugins like that don't have to... come on, what's the word? You don't have to... come on. You don't have to transfer all the audio and then transfer and transfer and transfer. yeah, if people do want to try getting into Linux, it's not nearly as command line based as it used to be. I've gotten the hang of Linux over the last couple of years. I used to be the server maintaining dude for a relatively medium scale media company. So we had web servers, we had data servers, we had all sorts of stuff. So I had to learn quite a lot of stuff. And it's actually not that bad once you get used to it. I learned on computers that were DOS based long before I had Windows. When I was just a wee little lad, I had a manual for DOS, an old 286 black and green screen machine. Yes, so let's get Reaper 6.05 downloaded. That downloaded in a terrifyingly quick amount of time. And while streaming, this computer is still managing to install Reaper in about... There we go, done. That's ridiculously fast. I just want to see the render window, bear with me people, and see where the rendering to MP3 thing is at the same time. Automation items when copy pasting media items. Yep. Right, that's good. Yeah, so if you copy and paste something, all the automation attached to it moves with it now as well. That's great. Yeah, apparently there are tutorials that you can run Windows plugins in Reaper in Linux in Wine. Wine is not a Windows emulator, but it kind of is. Yeah, you can definitely do that. Because the processor is the same, and so the instructions are, generally speaking, the same. And so, yeah, it's not that much of a leap to do a code translation like that. Where you start to hit roadblocks is with plugins that use the iLock. Can you use Thunderbolt in Linux? Don't know. Because Thunderbolt would probably present itself as primary and secondary output format. Sorry, I've got to get this on screen. See if I can get this in OBS. Window capture. Yeah, there we go. So I'll just get that low down enough that you can all see it. There we go. So yes, this is amazing. So primary output format. This wasn't here literally in 6.04. This is what I love about Reaper. This is ridiculous. Only on Sunday I was having to render out a whole song, well, a whole set of songs twice, which took 40 minutes instead of 20 because it was basically an EP's worth to get a WAV file and an MP3 file. And the fact that I can go WAV 24-bit and I can go MP3 however many bit, that's ridiculous. I mean, I'm glad they finally added it. I don't know why my version of lame is a little out of date. 3.99.5. I'll see if I can get 3.99 or 3.100. But that's, yeah, don't even worry about it. So, yeah. See, that's what I love about Reaper, is that, yeah, 6.04 didn't have that, 6.05 has that. And they just add things and add things and add things and add things. And that's why it's kind of hard sometimes to go, well, you know, in this version they had this and in this version they had that, because if you go, well, actually at version 5.2 it didn't have half the stuff it's got now. And at 5.99 or whatever it was, it had all the stuff. Reaper 6 had a few small updates, which are good updates. But then since then, they've already got this new feature, which is going to save me hours of time. Literally hours. Over the years, that's going to save me tons of time. The new Focusrite interface, the Solo, has USB 3. I got news for you, buddy. USB 3 doesn't give you any benefit for audio over USB 2. Sorry about that. I've explained this on the channel several times, but it's to do with data packets and transfer speed. USB 3 can handle larger packets of data, but it doesn't actually do them any more quickly. So, yeah, it's kind of a fallacy. So, yeah, there's that. Now, we've run over time a little bit, which I don't mind because I'm not keeping anybody waiting. But unless anyone's got any last questions, I'm going to sign off fairly soon. So I'm getting into kind of Adam's rambling soapbox time, which is, kind of my favourite time, but, everybody starts to be like, oh, Grandad. So, yeah, I'm not going to leave you too long. But yes, Jeremy Vareo, Jerevil, the kid, the man with many nicknames, is going to be my co-host next week. That's going to be really interesting. He's quite the character. So I'm very much looking forward to that. One last thing while you're all here. If you would be so kind as to hit the like button, that really helps us to spread the word on the channel, because that actually influences YouTube's propensity to share this video with other people. If there's no likes on it, despite the fact that everybody enjoyed it, then you guys see it and that's about it. But if you all hit like, then other people get to see it too, because YouTube's weird like that, and it's very much appreciated. Okay. Ooh, that's always a good thought. David in chat says, like the idea, if I ever upgrade to a CPU with a silly number of cores, I love the idea of running a few machines in one box. So that's actually something that's incredibly common in the server industry now, because for years now, both Intel and AMD processors have been made with virtualization technology built into the chip, which means they're designed specifically to be able to do that with pretty much no performance penalty. So if you got a 32 core machine, you could have quad core Windows this, quad core Windows that, quad core Linux this, quad core Mac OS Hackintosh type thing. If in that instance, if that's just kind of playing around with something, or if you just want to grab something out of Logic or Final Cut or something like that. I've often thought about having an older MacBook in the studio for that purpose, for having Logic Pro and Final Cut on there in case a client brings me a project that I wouldn't otherwise be able to open. So that might be a sound investment. Also, then I could do kind of generation to generation, how powerful is a Mac, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But I don't want to spend silly money. And unfortunately, Macs, because of the name, tend to hold their value far better than they really should for the hardware they have in them. Which has always been my major protest with Apple. It's not that they make bad stuff, although sometimes they have. Generally, they don't. Let's not talk about the 8-core MacBook Pro that essentially melts and can't get the heat out. But linking peripherals to VMs is quite a challenge. That depends on how you build your box. It's better than it ever has been. There are things like there's a program called Unraid, which is a way to not necessarily VM, but actually have a copy of Windows running on 4 cores, a copy of Linux running on 6 cores, and if you put separate USB cards in the machine, you can actually say to it, well, this card is going to be dedicated to this version of Windows, this card's going to be dedicated to this version of Linux, etc., etc. And doing it that way. And you can also then go, well, this graphics card is for this machine, this graphics card is for this machine. So if you're doing heavy video work, or if you're doing any sort of rendering, you can have several render farms on the same machine now. So yeah, there's loads and loads of possibility. You'd need quite a big case and a lot of cooling to do it all in one. And depending on the costing, it might actually be cheaper to do them as separate boxes and run a KVM or something like that. But if you can make it efficient, if you can, especially with these new high core count processors, it might be not the most ridiculous version. But try that with the RME with no latency. No, that would genuinely not affect latency because of the way that Unraid works. Unraid would patch that card through bare metal to the hardware, to the VM. You'd be surprised. Because of the way that it works, level 1 text, they call it IOMMU groups. It gets really quite head-mashingly complicated, but the way it works is that the virtualization software on the processors now, you can actually program it. So you say to the processor, this VM, or this VM that uses these cores has direct access to this card, which also means none of the other installations on that machine have access to that card. It's dedicated. But because of that, there's no barrier, there's no middleman. So, yeah. RME, definitely. Universal Audio, I don't know. That would depend if the Thunderbolt is passed through ABL. That depends on motherboard manufacturers, that depends on all sorts of stuff. You're best off watching level 1 techs videos and stuff like Linus Tech Tips where they talk about like 8 gamers, 1 CPU and all that kind of crazy stuff. That's where they talk a lot about virtualization and using Unraid, and that was my path into a lot of that. I'd done stuff with VMware before that, which isn't necessarily the same because that's all software layers. Eduardo Allison, one of our patrons, hello! If you've not looked at our Patreon, please check out Patreon because that helps us to carry on. Nice mic. So this is a Rode pod mic. That's this. And I have filmed a video for this and it's halfway through the editing stage. It's actually very affordable microphone. I think it's £99, something like $110. And it's a dedicated podcast mic that's really quite affordable. Rode make the Podcaster Pro, I think it's called, which is quite a long mic that's a little more expensive and in the realm of something like the Electro Voice RE20, which is probably even nicer sounding than this. This does have a little bit of an issue with popping, and I'm having to be quite careful not to do that. But it's a large diaphragm dynamic mic, and I compared it in the video that I filmed to an SM57, and it was night and day. The SM57 kind of sounded like this, whereas this sounds nice and crisp and clear. So doesn't need phantom power, does need quite a bit of gain, but that's not uncommon for a dynamic mic, especially with a large diaphragm. And yeah, it sounds like this. We're currently working to get a similar setup for Liam as well, so that when we're back, the two of us together, it's not like golden voice versus headset anymore. Yes, one of our other viewers, MarTV, did become a patron last week, and that is definitely appreciated. It all helps, it really does. It's the kind of thing that literally keeps the lights on. These two lights, as I was saying, I used to use battery packs with them. The battery packs are now at the studio for the spotlights that I've got there, but I was having a problem every week where, because I'm a forgetful idiot, I would take the batteries out to use them for the studio and then forget to bring them back and have no lights. So I got these things called dummy batteries, which have an AC to DC adapter, and they have a battery-shaped connector with a plug, and then you plug them in, and then suddenly lights that were only battery-powered are suddenly, you can power them from the wall. And because this setup is permanent, this isn't going anywhere, that means that I now definitely have permanent lighting. So much easier. So that's the kind of thing where I could only really afford. I mean, they were £20 for a dummy plug each, so not crazy expensive, but enough that I would really have been like, can't afford to do stuff like that. But because of the support from Patreon, that was possible, which means that this show looks good every week. and now is going to be consistently good. So I'm probably going to... I've just also bought another one of these arms so that we can get Liam's microphone on one of these. He's going to be using the Audient Evo as his interface. I've got the Sono, and I've sent the SM7B off for repair. Hopefully that comes back soon. And so between them, yes, Clark Technic CT1. It's like a cheap cloud lifter. Well, that's the thing. There's all the noise. If you can hear any noise on this, that's actually from the fact that there's a boiler behind me in this cupboard here. Because this is not the most glamorous section of my house. Wouldn't mind my opinion on the Clark Technic compressors. Yeah, but I'm not going to go out and buy one. I mean, they're basically Behringer compressors because Clark Technic's now owned by Music Tribe. And, I mean, it wouldn't hurt me to reach out to their marketing department, I'm sure, but I tend not to use anything like compression on the way in anyway, so that could be a little tricky. But I can try them. Yeah, so... Yeah, so Marty saw the NAM vlog, fantastic. Yeah, that took me quite a while to get that edited together because there's so much content in that video. I think it was something like 4 hours of video that I shaved down to 37 minutes. That's just ridiculous. And so, yeah, it's really interesting. And I left the full JHS interview in there, I think, rather than releasing that as a separate video, because that was the one where I went up to Josh Scott and was like, and so in context of the rest of that video, you can see how I was like, it was the start of the week, I was really hyped up, and it kind of makes sense on its own. You're like, God, he's so unprofessional, I'm never watching his videos again. What's my thought on a great in-the-box microphone preamp? What, like a software preamp? Again, surprise, surprise, in-the-box microphone preamps don't do very much. Not that that's a bad thing. People think that preamps have these massive volume, like tonal differences. They don't. The entire purpose of a microphone preamp is to make this thing louder. So generally speaking, you get far more tonal difference out of changing microphones than you do out of preamps. And people get like the Slate ones are great, like the FGN and FG 76, is it? The one that's the Telefunken. I use them quite a lot. And people say, oh, I can't hear the difference, turn it on, turn it off. Oh, it's hardly worth the difference. When you stack it up over 30 or 40 channels, it starts to make a difference. But I just find that if you can get really, really clean, really low noise, really clear sounding modern preamps on your equipment, you're kind of set, because from there you can do something like the Arturia's version of the Neve preamp was quite nice, but you get a lot more tonal difference out of the Arturia one just by touching the EQ section, and I mean really gently touching the EQ section, than actually doing much with the preamps. People think they want loads of drive out preamps, and then suddenly a singer will belt a note out and it sounds distorted, and they're like, no, I didn't want that. And you're like, well, that's been the battle with preamplification for 50 years. Listen to stuff early Beatles and anything that's before that from the mid-60s. They were struggling because there was distortion on everything. Not because they wanted it, but because the technology of the time, they couldn't avoid it. You had two choices. Either get enough gain out of your microphones that the tubes in the preamp started to distort a little bit, or have things so quiet that the noise floor going into whatever you were recording onto was so high it became unusable. Those were your choices. And so since then, we've been trying to get cleaner and cleaner and cleaner preamps. And we've got to the point now where the normal, regular recording engineer can afford these clean preamps. And now we're saying, oh, well, I miss that sound. I want that distortion. I want that drive. So, yeah, Marty says, I want an actual Neve. I mean, I do and I don't. If I could have a bank of 24 Neve 1073 preamps, I'd be very happy. I'm not going to say I wouldn't be, but I wouldn't need the rest of the desk. Because of the way that I work, specifically me, not anybody else, I would find the rest of that desk redundant. I don't mix through a desk. I don't want to mix through a desk. I am of the opinion of guys like Andrew Sheps, where it's like, well, this stuff did get me a great sound, but I can now get that great sound in something far more convenient. Like, for example, the punk band that I played you earlier, I mixed that in the studio, sounded great, listened to it on the drive home in the car. In my head, I thought, oh, I don't like this, I don't like that, I'll make a few mix tweaks. I got home, turned on my laptop, and within 10 minutes, my laptop had downloaded all the files from Dropbox of the entire mix session. I had my iLock in my bag, plugged it into my laptop, got my headphones on, made those mix changes, and hit export. And within 30 minutes, I'd already uploaded new mixes to the band. And you can't do that with an analog setup. You just can't. And that's why guys like Andrew Sheps, he's like, well, I got a call from Beyonce's agent. Can we change the snare or whatever it was? I can't remember the exact details. And he's on a train in the middle of Europe. And he goes, yeah, just let me get my headphones on, turn on my laptop. Whereas usually that would be, sorry, I'm out of the studio. I would have to fly back to wherever I was, physically set up everything, which might take an hour or two, then make these small changes that you wanted me to change, then hope that that's right. Whereas if I can do everything in the box, I can call it up no matter where I am. It'll take me a little while, like 5 minutes maybe, to get that all turned on, get my headphones on. And I'm not suggesting that you should mix on headphones. I'm quite comfortable with my setup now, but I do tend to do the majority of my mix balancing on my monitors. But for small changes where you know everything's fine apart from a small detail or two, and especially with SonarWorks, I really find that SonarWorks plus these 650s changes everything. Because now, like, sub bass was never really a thing on on 650s, whereas SonarWorks brings all that out. There was a nasty kind of 1K honk that was a couple of dB. That's now gone. There was a little bit of a presence peak missing in the 650s. That's now sorted out. So yeah, that's that. Right, last question. Do I use an escrow website where my clients pay online, then get the download? Here that saves a lot of hassle on the business side. No, I don't. I don't do that because I would find that to be quite a lot of messing around. I try and keep it simple wherever possible. If it's a small job, like mixing a song, then I get the client to pay up front. If it's less than, say, £250, which to some people is a lot of money, but in business, that's not a huge amount, then I just get them to pay up front, and then I get going, and then that's done. If they're in the studio, I tend to take a deposit off people, a small deposit, maybe £100, £150, depending on the size of the project, just so that I know they're not going to completely ghost me and bail on the day, because generally speaking, people are much more likely to turn up if they've paid money. I always find that. But then, at the end of the last day, before I physically hand over tracks, I then take the rest of the money, because we know by that point whether the band's happy with the work we've done or not. If it's online, then it either is all up front or it's 50-50, 50% up front if it's a big project, and then 50% at the end, because then again that money up front proves that they're serious, that they want to work with me, and they're not just giving me a load of hot air. And then the rest of it I tend to put as, well, I've now got all your details and that kind of thing. But depends on the client. But generally speaking, I might then, again, before final files are released, they then sort that out. And I've never had an issue doing that. Especially with 50% deposit on a bigger project. The worst that can happen then is I'm out by 50%, which is still better than out by 100%. I definitely wouldn't just do stuff for free these days. But it depends on the client. It depends on the situation. If it's someone that I know that I've got as a repeat client, I might just be a bit lax with it. If it's someone I'm definitely wary of, then it's upfront or nothing. But generally just don't be taken for a ride. If it's working with corporations as well, then in that case, if it's more of a corporate job, then it might be that the invoice is a 30-day invoice anyway, but that's different to working with a personal client, as it were. If I was to do some sound editing or something like that for a recognizable brand, then you generally just don't expect to be paid up front. But generally speaking, you put a proper invoice in with your company number on and your payment details and all that kind of stuff that's payable within 30 days. You expect to be paid, and they probably won't pay you until the end of those 30 days because that's what companies are like. But at that point, you'll get paid because it's not worth their reputation, or it's not worth them having people knocking on the door, that kind of thing. It's not worth legal stuff. I don't know. So I think that will have to be the last question of the day, because it's always an hour podcast and we're already an hour and a half in. So this is what happens. So even though it's been me on my little soapbox talking for the rest of the evening, it's been very enjoyable. I'll try and get this up on iTunes and Spotify podcasts this evening, if not first thing in the morning. I'm in the studio first thing in the morning. I've got to go and pick up some DI boxes from Latvia. I'm testing out a 5150 versus a 6505. That's going to be a lot of fun. I've got a lot to do tomorrow, so I'm going to be much busy. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next week with our special guest, Jeremy Vareo, 8 p.m. UK time, which is 1 p.m. PST. So I'll see you guys then. Let's leave you out with our new mix on the intro and outro. Here we go.